Sometimes you have to lose everything you have just to find the one thing money can't buy: loyalty and true love. Anthony was no ordinary mechanic. He was the only son of Chief Nathaniel Williams, one of Nigeria's most powerful business moguls, a man whose name opened doors in banks, ministries, and even presidential villas. His family's fortune stretched from oil and gas to real estate, shipping, and media. But Anthony had grown to despise the walls of gold around him. Wealth, he had learned, was a double-edged sword. Every smile from a woman carried a price tag. Every handshake from a man came with an agenda. He could no longer tell who saw him as a human being and who saw him as a walking ATM. He had seen his father arrange meetings with daughters of senators, oil tycoons, and foreign ambassadors, all perfect wives by society's standard. They came in diamond heels, practiced laughs, and perfume that cost more than the average Nigerian's yearly salary. They all loved Anthony, or rather, they loved the thought of becoming Mrs. Williams. Anthony Williams sat alone in his penthouse, high above the glittering skyline of Lagos. To the world, he's a billionaire everyone admired. Young, handsome, successful, the kind of man people bowed to, not because they respected him, but because of the size of his bank account. And that was the problem. He was tired. Tired of fake smiles. Tired of friends who love him because of his fat wallet. Tired of women who loved his cars more than his heart. That night, as he poured himself a glass of water, he looked at his reflection in the tall glass windows. "If I keep living like this, I'll never know who's real," he muttered. Then came the idea, a crazy, risky, almost ridiculous idea. What if he stripped away the riches? What if he became ordinary? The next morning, he walked into his father's study, the room smelling faintly of expensive cigars and old leather. "Papa," Anthony said, "I'm not doing any more introductions. No blind dates, no arranged dinners. If I marry, I'll find her myself." His father raised an eyebrow. "And where will you find this miracle woman?" "In the real world," Anthony replied, "where people work for every naira they eat." Chief Nathaniel chuckled, shaking his head. "You've lived too long in comfort to survive there. But go try your experiment. Just know, women these days, loyalty is rare." 2 weeks later, Anthony Williams no longer existed, at least not to the public. He became Tony, a struggling mechanic from a modest neighborhood in Surulere. The designer suits were replaced with faded jeans and oil-stained shirts. The Rolex watches were replaced with a cheap 1,500 naira wristwatch from a roadside seller. The luxury car collection? Parked in his private underground garage, he now drove an old Toyota Corolla with a noisy engine. Even his phone changed. No more iPhone 15 Pro Max, just a small, cracked screen Techno. He lived in a small one-room apartment with peeling paint, shared bathroom, and neighbors who fought loudly about NEPA bills. He ate roadside akara for breakfast, took Danfo buses to work. No one knew that the young man fixing dented Toyotas and changing oil filters in a dusty mechanic shop in Surulere was heir to a fortune worth over N500 billion. Anthony wanted something real. He wanted a woman who would stand beside him, not because of what he could give her, but because of who he truly was. He had no idea that this decision would lead him to the most loyal and the most heartbreaking love story of his life. Grace balanced the heavy cooler of steaming jollof rice on her hip, her forehead glistening under the Lagos afternoon sun. The metallic clang of Danfo buses, impatient honking of Kiki drivers, and the constant chatter of street vendors filled the air. She had learned to tune it all out. Right now, her mind was on one thing: selling enough food to cover her mother's hospital bill and still have something left for her younger siblings' school fees. Her life hadn't always been this hard. Just 3 years ago, the family had lived comfortably in a neat three-bedroom apartment. Her father, a civil servant, provided well enough. But when he died suddenly of a stroke, their world crumbled. Her mother's small tailoring business wasn't enough to keep them afloat, and Grace had to drop out of university after her first year. Now she spent her mornings cooking and her afternoons selling food by the roadside, dodging the advances of jobless men and the insults of impatient customers. The afternoon sun in Lagos was merciless, beating down on the corrugated roofs of the roadside shops. The dusty air carried the aroma of sizzling plantains and freshly cooked jollof rice. Grace stood behind her wooden table, fanning herself with an old newspaper, her face glistening with sweat. It had been a slow day, and she was already worried about how much she'd be able to contribute for her mother's evening medication. A loud rattling sound broke through the chatter of pedestrians. An old beat-up Toyota Corolla rolled to a stop just a few meters from her stand, coughing out a puff of smoke from the exhaust. The driver, a tall, broad-shouldered man in oil-stained jeans and a plain t-shirt, stepped out, frowning as if the car had personally offended him. "Now, he muttered under his breath, lifting the bonnet. "This card'm finally decided to disgrace me today." Grace watched him for a moment, biting back a smile. He didn't look like the type who could afford a new car anytime soon. From his grease-streaked hands and calm patience, he could have been any struggling mechanic in Lagos. "Bros, maybe your car just a protest say you know to feed him well," Grace teased, leaning slightly on her table. Anthony looked up, surprised at her boldness, but there was amusement in his eyes. "And you, madam, you be car doctor? Abi, you sabi fix engine too?" Grace smirked. "No be engine I sabi fix na belly, and from the way you look, you need food more than your car needs repair." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Ah, so you dey insult me and advertise at the same time? Smart businesswoman." Something about the way he laughed caught Grace off guard. It wasn't the fake, boastful laugh she was used to from men trying to impress her. It was warm, genuine. She didn't know she was looking at a man whose signature could sign away millions. Out of habit, she reached for a small sachet of water, tore it open, and handed it to him. "Here, free of charge, for the sake of your poor sweating self." Anthony took it, smiling slightly. "Ah, this one sweet pass chilled Coke. Thank you." They stood there for a moment, the billionaire in disguise and the woman who had no idea she was speaking to one. Neither knew that this seemingly ordinary roadside meeting was the first spark of something that would change both their lives forever. Anthony leaned against the bonnet of his dusty old Corolla, watching the lively chaos of the street. Okada riders zoomed past, traders shouted prices over the hum of traffic, and the scent of fried plantain drifted from Grace's food stand. He pretended to be busy tinkering with his car engine, but his eyes kept wandering back to her. Grace balanced a steaming plate in one hand, the other hand reaching into her apron to give change to a customer. Then, without hesitation, she wrapped up her own lunch, hot jollof rice and fried fish, and handed it to a frail beggar who had shuffled to her stall. The beggar's eyes welled up. "God bless you, my daughter," he said, voice trembling. Grace just smiled, waving him off. "No need, Baba. Eat well." Anthony felt something shift inside him. Most people would have looked away, maybe given coins. But Grace had given her food, and not the leftovers, her own meal. He thought of the many women he'd met at high-end events, women dripping in diamonds, but starved of compassion. Grace was different. Oga mechanic," Grace called out, snapping him from his thoughts. "Are you fixing the car or staring at my stall? Because if you want food, join the queue." Anthony chuckled, walking closer. "I was admiring your customer service. 5-star treatment." She scoffed. Beg, I'm not running any fancy hotel, hero. This is survival. You either eat or Lagos will eat you. They both laughed. Her tone was sharp but not unkind, and there was a refreshing honesty in her words. You didn't eat, Anthony noted, glancing at the now empty plate she'd given away. Grace shrugged. Food will come again, but some people, if they don't eat now, tomorrow might be too late. Anthony's chest warmed. She had no idea she was speaking to a man who could buy every plate in the market 10 times over. But that was the point. She treated him like an equal, not a walking bank account. When he finally left that evening, his car engine miraculously fixed after minimal effort, Anthony found himself smiling the whole drive home. He didn't just like Grace's face or her laughter. He liked her heart. And that was dangerous, because if she ever found out who he really was, he wasn't sure she'd look at him the same way again. Anthony found himself returning to Grace's roadside food stand almost every afternoon, even when his so-called car troubles had been long fixed. Sometimes he'd park across the road just to watch her work, laughing with customers, expertly serving steaming plates of jollof rice and fried plantain, wiping sweat from her brow without complaint. Grace had a way of making everyone feel seen, from the taxi driver who only had enough for a half plate to the school children who came with coins clutched tightly in their hands. And Anthony was slowly becoming part of that world. Ah, my special mechanic Don's show again? Grace teased one sunny afternoon, flashing a playful smile as she placed his usual order, white rice with stew and fried fish. I'm only here because your food has spiritual powers, Anthony replied, grinning. I eat it, and all my problems disappear. Grace laughed, shaking her head. Be careful. Oh, that's how you'll end up owing me for life. They began to talk more, about music, about Lagos traffic, about the struggles of making ends meet. Grace spoke about her sick mother and the constant hospital bills. She spoke about her younger siblings, Chinedu, who dreamed of becoming a lawyer, and Amaka, who was still in secondary school. Anthony listened, truly listened, and his respect for her grew. She never complained like someone looking for pity. She spoke like a fighter determined to keep going. One day, as he was helping her carry a sack of rice from the supplier's van, Grace asked, Anthony, you never talk about your own family. Not only me to yarn my whole life here. Anthony hesitated for a moment, tightening his grip on the sack. Let's just say, my family's complicated. She raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. No wahala. Everybody get their own wahala. When you're ready, you go talk. And that was how it stayed. Her mystery mechanic with the kind eyes and his guarded past. Neither of them knew it yet, but these small moments were weaving something stronger than friendship. The days rolled into weeks, and Anthony's presence at Grace's roadside stand became as constant as the smoky aroma of roasted plantain that hung in the Lagos evening air. It started with casual visits, buying a plate of jollof rice, sometimes just a sachet of water. But gradually it became something more. Grace didn't mind. She had grown used to seeing him approach, hands in his pockets, that mischievous smile playing on his lips. She noticed the little things, how he always helped her carry heavy pots inside after she closed for the day, how he quietly slipped money into the hands of street kids without seeking praise, how he sometimes looked like a man carrying the weight of a secret. One Tuesday evening, after the last customer had left, Anthony suggested they take a walk. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting a golden glow over the busy streets. They walked side by side, munching roasted corn from a roadside vendor, the cob still steaming hot. You never told me what your dream is, Anthony said, glancing at her. Grace chuckled. Dream? My dream is to survive tomorrow without being chased by LASMA or harassed by market thugs. He laughed, shaking his head. No, I mean your real dream. The one that keeps you awake at night. Grace grew quiet for a moment, her gaze fixed ahead. I want to open a proper restaurant, not this roadside life. Somewhere clean, beautiful, where my mother can sit and eat without worrying about dust or noise. I want my siblings to finish school. And maybe, she hesitated, then added softly, maybe one day I'll meet someone who sees me for more than just a food seller. Anthony's chest tightened. He wanted to tell her he already saw her that way, that she was more than she knew. But he kept quiet, instead offering her the bigger half of the corn. Over the next few weeks, their routine became a comfort. They shared suya on rainy nights, laughed at funny customers, and sometimes sat in silence, watching Danfoss weave dangerously through traffic. Grace still thought Anthony was just another struggling Lagos hustler, but she couldn't deny that he made her feel seen. Yet in Anthony's mind, the friendship was no longer just friendship. Every laugh, every shared meal, every story she told was pulling him deeper into something he wasn't sure he could control, especially knowing that sooner or later the truth about who he really was would change everything. Anthony sat quietly at the wooden bench outside Grace's little food stall, his eyes lowered, voice heavy. Grace, I think I'm in trouble, he said, pretending to fidget with his hands. Her brows furrowed immediately. What happened? Are you sick? He shook his head. No, but I lost my job today. I mistakenly broke an expensive car windscreen, and my boss got angry and asked me never to return to his shop ever again. Things are really bad. If I don't get something soon, I might have to go back to the village. Grace froze, the sound of frying oil hissing behind her. Back to the village. Anthony, mistake happens. You've been here for years. You can't just... I can't pay rent anymore, he said with a sad smile. And I don't want to burden anyone. Lagos is hard. Maybe it's time to give up. Grace's heart twisted. She thought about the times Anthony had bought her food when she was short on change, the way he always made her laugh, and how he carried himself with dignity despite his simple clothes. She stepped closer, her voice firm. No, you're not leaving. I'll help you find another job. I know a woman at the supermarket. She's always looking for honest workers. Anthony's eyes softened. Grace, I can't. Shut up, she interrupted, pulling out a small tin from under her table. She counted a few crumpled notes, her savings for the month. Ew, here. It's not much, but it'll help you with something. You can have a free meal here until you get back on your feet. Anthony stared at her hand, stunned. You'd give me this? Grace, you barely have enough for yourself. She smiled faintly. That's what friends are for. And besides, I know you'd do the same for me. Anthony looked at her for a long moment, something tightening in his chest. She had no idea that her simple act of kindness was the very thing he had been searching for all along. That night, he walked away with her savings in his pocket, not because he needed the money, but because he needed the proof. Grace was loyal, even when she thought he had nothing. And Anthony knew she had just passed the test. The sun was just beginning to set over the bustling streets of Surulere. The warm orange glow bounced off rusty zinc roofs, and the smell of fried plantain and suya filled the air. Grace's food stand was as lively as ever, customers chatting, plates clattering, and her voice cheerful as always, greeting everyone with warmth. Anthony had just arrived, dressed in his usual faded jeans and plain shirt, blending perfectly into the background of struggling Lagosi hustlers. He carried his old battered backpack, the one Grace had once teased him about, and sat at his usual corner, quietly waiting for her to serve him. But today, Emeka was there. Emeka, the self-proclaimed big boy of the area. His tight shirt was stretched over his chest, his gold-plated wristwatch gleaming under the fading sunlight, and his car keys jingling loudly in his hand, as if the whole world needed to know he owned a car. He leaned against Grace's counter, flashing her his most practiced smile. "Grace, my angel," Ameka drawled, "leave these your roadside customers and let me take you to a proper restaurant. Imagine a fine girl like you serving food in this heat. You deserve better." Anthony glanced up briefly, his jaw tightening, but he kept quiet. Grace smiled politely. "Ameka, A-bag, leave matter for Matthias. I'm fine here. Who will feed my customers if I go to restaurant with you?" But Ameka wasn't done. His eyes darted toward Anthony, and his lips curved into a smirk. "So, you're still talking to this mechanic?" Ameka's voice dripped with mockery. "Grace, no vexo. But why you they waste your time with someone who can't even afford a decent shirt? Lagos girls like you should be aiming higher." The laughter from two nearby men stung Anthony, but he didn't rise to the bait. Grace, however, froze mid-serve. Her eyes narrowed. She put down the plate of jollof rice she was dishing and stepped closer to Ameka. "Ameka," she said, her voice calm but firm, "don't ever talk about my friends like that." "Friends?" Ameka laughed mockingly. "Grace, open your eyes. People like him will only drag you down. Me, I can cook my own food, work for my own money, and choose my own friends." Grace cut in sharply. "Anthony is kind, respectful, and honest. Something your gold chain can't buy." The crowd went silent. Anthony's head lifted slightly, his eyes softening as he looked at her. Ameka's face twisted in embarrassment. "Fine, keep your broke mechanic. Don't say I didn't warn you." He turned and stalked off, muttering under his breath. Grace sighed and turned to Anthony, her smile returning. "Ignore him. Some people think money makes them better than others." Anthony's lips curved into a small, genuine smile. "Thank you, Grace, for defending me." She shrugged. Friends look out for each other. But deep inside, Anthony felt something stir, a mix of gratitude, admiration, and something far more dangerous. That day, he knew. Grace had unknowingly taken another piece of his guarded heart. The night sky over Lagos was unusually clear, its vast darkness scattered with countless stars that shimmered like tiny diamonds. The gentle breeze carried the distant aroma of roasted corn and suya, mixed with the earthy scent of wet sand from the day's brief rain. Grace sat beside Anthony on a low wooden bench just outside her small shop, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. They had been talking about life, about struggles, about dreams that seemed almost too far to reach. Anthony's deep voice was calm, but his heart was thundering in his chest. He had been carrying the little box in his pocket for 3 days, waiting for the perfect moment, and tonight felt right. Grace lifted her head to smile at him. "You're unusually quiet," she teased. "Are you thinking about your village again?" Anthony chuckled softly, his eyes on the night sky. "No, Grace. I'm thinking about something more important. About us." Before she could reply, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a tiny velvet pouch. It wasn't grand, it wasn't fancy, but it held everything he had been wanting to give her. Grace's eyes followed his movements, curiosity growing. "Grace," Anthony began, his voice low but steady, "since the day I met you at your stand, I've known there was something different about you. You didn't look at me the way others did. You didn't care that my shirt was faded or that my shoes were worn. You saw me the real me, and I've never had that before." Her breath caught, her lips parting slightly. He opened the pouch and brought out a simple silver-colored ring he had bought from a roadside vendor in town. It had cost him just in 100, but to him, it was priceless. "I don't have gold or diamonds," he said softly. "I can't promise you riches or an easy life, but I can promise you this loyalty, respect, and a love that will never fade. Grace, will you marry me?" For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The sound of distant generators, the chirping of night crickets, everything faded into the background. Grace's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. She didn't even glance at the ring's simplicity. Instead, she looked straight into his eyes. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, Anthony, I will marry you." He slid the ring onto her finger. It was slightly loose, but she held her hand like it was the most precious jewel in the world. Anthony's heart swelled as she threw her arms around him, holding him tight. In that moment, she wasn't saying yes to a man she thought was rich or powerful. She was saying yes to the man she believed in. Grace's heart swelled. She didn't care if the ring was gold, silver, or even plastic. The man kneeling before her was the only treasure she needed. What she didn't know was that the man she just agreed to marry wasn't the poor mechanic she thought he was, but a billionaire testing the depth of her heart. Under the quiet blessing of the stars, Anthony knew he had found someone who loved him, not for what he had, but for who he was. The wedding day dawned with the soft glow of Harmattan sunlight spilling through Anthony's modest apartment. There was no convoy of luxury cars, no designer suits, and no millionaire hall bookings. Instead, the venue was a small, borrowed church hall at the edge of the city, decorated with locally cut flowers and a few ribbons donated by neighbors. Only his most trusted friends, those who had proven loyal during his secret test, knew the truth about Anthony's hidden wealth. The rest of the world still believed he was just an ordinary man, barely scraping by. Grace arrived in a simple cream gown she had borrowed from her cousin. The gown had a tiny tear near the hem, but to her it was the most beautiful thing she had ever worn. She walked down the aisle smiling, her eyes fixed on Anthony, her heart pounding with excitement and certainty. Her family, however, sat stiff in the front row, their faces clouded with disappointment. To them, Grace had wasted her beauty and youth on a man who couldn't offer her a rich life. Her aunt whispered sharply to a relative, "She could have married that wealthy man from the neighborhood. Look at what she chose instead." Anthony noticed the disapproving glances, but kept his expression calm. This was part of the plan. He needed to be absolutely sure Grace's love was unshakable. When the pastor asked if she would take Anthony as her husband, for better, for worse, Grace's voice rang clear and confident. "I do," she said without a moment's hesitation, as though she were being offered the world. The guests clapped politely, but Anthony's most trusted friends exchanged knowing smiles. They could already see the fireworks this humble union would unleash when the truth finally came out. Little did Grace know, the real wedding gift he had planned would turn her life upside down. The first 2 days of their honeymoon had been simple: walks on the beach, cheap local meals, and late-night laughter in a modest guest house. Grace was convinced Anthony had booked their trip on a shoestring budget, and she loved every second of it. On the third morning, Anthony woke her with a soft kiss. "Pack your bags," he whispered. "We're going somewhere special." Grace chuckled. "Special? Where?" Anthony only smiled mysteriously. An hour later, a sleek, black SUV pulled up. Grace frowned. "SUV? On this budget?" She climbed in, clutching her small travel bag, still suspicious. When they arrived at a private airstrip, she froze. Before them was a gleaming white private jet with his initials, AC, painted boldly on the side. Her voice trembled. "Anthony, whose jet is this?" He took her hand, leading her toward the steps. "Ours, Grace. Well, mine. But soon, ours." The flight was smooth and silent, her mind racing the entire time. And then, Dubai. The skyline glistened like a sea of gold under the sun. The flight was smooth and silent, her mind racing the entire time. And then, Dubai. The skyline glistened like a sea of gold under the sun. As they drove to a seven-star hotel, Anthony finally turned to her, his eyes soft. "I lied to you," he began. Her chest tightened. "What do you mean?" "I'm not a poor man. I'm Anthony Williams, the only heir to Nathaniel Williams. I own real estate, oil shares, and multiple companies. But I needed to know if you loved me, or my money." Grace's mouth fell open. She was dumbfounded, tears streaming down before she could stop them. "Anthony, all this time, you tested me?" He nodded, voice breaking. "And you passed. You've given me something no money can buy. True love." Grace collapsed into his arms, sobbing against his chest. She wasn't crying because of the wealth. She was crying because the man she had fallen in love with had loved her enough to make sure it was real. In that moment, the skyscrapers outside were nothing compared to the richness in her heart. The gates of Anthony's estate swung open slowly, revealing a sprawling mansion that glistened under the afternoon sun. Grace's jaw dropped. It wasn't just a house, it was a palace. The air was scented with fresh roses, and the long driveway was lined with golden lamps. "Welcome home, my queen," Anthony whispered, his voice rich with pride. As they stepped out of the limousine, Anthony's family, board members, and closest friends were waiting, dressed in elegant attire. Grace froze, overwhelmed by the warm applause that erupted as she approached. Anthony's mother stepped forward, tears shining in her eyes. "I prayed for a woman who would love my son for who he is, not what he has," she said, embracing Grace tightly. "You are that answer." Servants handed Grace a bouquet of lilies, Anthony's favorite flower. The scent made her heart swell. Later that evening, during a grand dinner in her honor, Anthony stood and raised his glass. "This beautiful woman," he began, "chose me when she thought I had nothing. She saw my worth beyond material things, and for that, I will honor her for the rest of my life." He signaled to an aide who brought forward an envelope. Grace opened it and gasped. It was a legal document transferring in $500 million worth of shares in his company to her name. Her eyes blurred with tears. "Anthony, this is too much." "No," he said, shaking his head with a smile. "It's not enough. You're worth more than gold." The dinning erupted in applause, and Grace wept openly, her heart heavy with gratitude and love. In the weeks that followed, Anthony donated millions to orphanages, widows' funds, and educational projects, all in Grace's name. She became a symbol of humility and compassion, her story inspiring thousands of young women across the country. True wealth is not measured by the size of your bank account, but by the depth of your heart. Love that sees beyond riches is the rarest treasure of all,